Hello. Today we will be addressing adolescent obesity by discussing who is the most deeply affected and why, what psychological features affects teens who are overweight, and what meaningful interventions are taking place. We'll begin with discussing who is the most deeply impacted by obesity in their teen years. As childhood obesity rates skyrocket in the United States, the government has deemed it an epidemic. It appears that African American communities have been especially hard hit. African American adolescents are almost twice as likely to be overweight or at risk of becoming overweight in comparison to their white counterparts. In order to understand this phenomena, we must simultaneously examine the injustices faced by the Black community in America, such as poverty, inequality, and prejudice, as well as the role of fast food companies play in African American urban communities and schools. African Americans are still today faced with many of the same oppressive conditions of prejudice and inequality, as well as poverty that were in place long before the civil rights movement purported to guarantee equal rights. This is clearly apparent in the national statistics. At present, 48% of African American families live below the poverty level in mother-headed households and are 2 to 4 times more likely than whites to be poor. When it comes to health and nutrition, the statistics are even more startling. Good health requires a diet of vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy foods, as well as cutting back on high-fiber, high-sugar choices. However, making healthy meals at home requires more time and money. Many low-income families choose prepared and convenience food that require less preparation and time and are less expensive, but unfortunately have higher concentrations of calories. In many African American urban communities, there is a lack of availability of healthy food items to be purchased, as they have smaller grocery stores with higher prices and less affordability than supermarkets in white suburban communities. Also, many African American men and women in low-income communities lack transportation, therefore limiting their ability to purchase larger quantities of healthy food from supermarkets that are farther from their homes. In many white communities, the ratio of supermarkets per person is 1 for every 4,000 persons. While in African American neighborhoods, the ratio is significantly higher, 1 supermarket for every 24,000 people. Obviously, there is an inequality and prejudice that exists both within the locations of the supermarkets and in their saturation of fast food restaurants, with 35% of Black children and teens and their families being poor is virtually a biological warfare. As a result, there is a prevalence of low-priced, high-fat food restaurants and convenience stores located in low-income urban neighborhoods across the United States. Along with the lack of access to fresh, healthy food, this accessibility contributes to an overwhelmingly disproportionate number of deaths and illnesses among African Americans compared to whites. The result is that of heart disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, strokes, and obesity. In fact, nearly half of all African American children and adolescents born in the US will develop diabetes in their lifetime. In addition to a good diet, physical activity on a daily basis is important for good health. Researchers have made connections between puberty, psychosocial, and other behaviors that affect on the intention to engage in physical activity. It has been found that the typical drop in physical activity that occurs when a child reaches adolescence was twice as high for African Americans than in white teens. Researchers also found that compared to 56% of African American girls surveys lacked any consistent physical activity routine, and a higher number of African American participants watched TV and played on the computer or video games on an average of 4 hours a day, linking this behavior with a significant higher BMI. It appears that fast food corporations also play a role leading in the causing of unhealthy eating habits in poor minority communities. African American urban communities are monopolized by fast food restaurants and suffer as a result. Low prices offered by fast food chains attract low income families. McDonald's U.S. Chief of Marketing Officer Neil Goldman may very well be playing an essential role in the obesity epidemic in the African American community. In an article published in Business Week, Golden prided himself in his new marketing strategy, which he called Leading with Ethics Insights. By doubling the ads aimed at minority children and adolescents, Gold was able to increase the franchise sales in those communities. It has been found that McDonald's has an overrepresentation of the numbers of African Americans and other minorities in their focus groups. In these focus groups, they ask how would they sell a product if the population were only African American in order to help market their products to African American communities. One study found that food-related ads made up 1/4 of all advertised products viewed by teens, and that these ads reached 14% more African American teens versus white teens. Other junk food companies have followed, spending billions on advertising dollars in targeting Black and Hispanic teens. We know that minority teens are targeted by fast food companies that lead to unhealthy diets. How does eating foods high in sodium, trans fat, and cholesterol affect mental health? Adolescence is a time where there is both physical growth and sexual maturation. Are teens who are overweight at a greater risk of dating violence and victimization?
Hi, my name is Jaime Diaz, and I'll be addressing some of the psychological effects of obesity in adolescence. But before I move on to the psychological effects of obesity in adolescence, I would like to briefly address the physical consequences of obesity throughout the lifespan. These consequences can affect the individual at any point in their developmental stages, not just in adolescence. This may include an increased risk of heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, breathing problems, joint pain, hormonal changes, and or insomnia. This list, however, is not an all-inclusive list, but some of these consequences may also be a moderating factor in some of the psychological effects that will be addressed today. First, we have self-esteem. During adolescence, sexuality and romantic or sexual relationships are developing, and adolescents are trying to fit into these new roles. These areas of development are highly related to physical appearance, which can explain the relationship between body weight and self esteem. Obese adolescents have been found to be at a greater risk for developing an eating disorder. Among the eating disorders, binge eating disorder has been recognized as a common problem already existing in overweight adolescents. A well known risk factor for eating disorders is self esteem, which has also been found to be a related risk factor of obesity among the US adolescent population, which indicates that some adolescents with low self esteem in their results in their study, Iacone and colleagues indicate that some adolescents with low self esteem have a sense of ineffectiveness towards themselves. This then is projected to their bodies and as a defense mechanism, which produces bodily shame, which then creates a looping mechanism of low self esteem that leads to bodily shame, that leads to an eating pathology, and so on and so forth. It's a continuous looping mechanism that fits in itself for some of the adolescents with an obesity problem. There are some cross sectional studies that also demonstrate that obesity is inversely associated with self esteem and body esteem. But cultural differences can have an influence in body image, self esteem, and body weight. Some cultures place a higher value in thinness, while other cultures are more tolerant of obesity, which could suggest that this tolerance may serve as a protective barrier that, in turn, protects the adolescent's self esteem. Second, we have depression. Now, results of a study published in the International Journal of Obesity found that depression in 11 to 15-year-old adolescents was not associated with obesity. However, in adolescents between ages of 18 to 21, depression was associated with obesity, especially for women. These results do indicate that among women, depression occurring in early adolescence predicts the onset of obesity at a later time, while adolescents' obesity, particularly in late adolescence, is a strong predictor for depression. Additionally, this study found that the onset of depression and obesity is cross-sectionally associated in childhood and adolescence, but not at other developmental stages. Now, the depression pathway is not clear. The comorbidity and the correlation could have three different and distinct pathways. Pathway number one is obesity may predispose adolescents to depression. Pathway number two, depression may depression may predispose adolescents to obesity. Or number three, there is a third factor that may predispose adolescents to both. Now, it is important to consider that in the first pathway, the weight stigma, poor self esteem, and functional impairments, such as the inability to engage in activities, can lead to depression. In the second pathway, depressive symptoms such as poor sleep, increased appetite, and decreased calorie expenditure that is present with lethargy can lead directly to obesity. The third pathway for this co-occurrence can possibly be environmental common factors that directly affect adolescents, such as low socioeconomic status that leads to hopelessness and a reduced access to health, food, and safe and free recreational activities. It is important to recognize that eating and activity habits are being formed during childhood and adolescence, and the onset of obesity or depression can lead to the development of unhealthy habits that can be difficult to overcome once they are formed. Now we're going to talk about bullying. The next item I would like to address is bullying. In the results of a study that included 31,770 adolescents ages 10 to 17 found that while obese adolescents experience higher rates of all forms of bullying, whether it's weight-based, race-based, social economic status-based, and or sexual harassment, weight victimization is the most reported one. This weight-based victimization is associated with up to 50% increased likelihood of feelings of sadness, depression, and lower self esteem. This can then have negative effects in the social and emotional health and development of the victims, which can hinder their ability to develop peer relationships, engage socially during one of the most fundamental stages of development, in addition to the previously mentioned physical health effects that are common in overweight and adolescents. Now, this study did not show a higher chance of adolescents 10 to 17 years old of bullying, victimization, and perpetration at the same time. However, other studies, like a study by Poole and Ludicky, analyzed the emotional reaction and coping behaviors of 15 to 16-year-olds that were overweight or obese, and it found that they are more likely to engage in bullying behaviors when compared to their to other healthy weight adolescents. However, this relationship was not observed in the 11 to 14-year-old population in this study. Additionally, another cross-sectional study by Jansen and Associates of the health behavior in school-aged children found that obese 15 to 16-year-old adolescents had a higher chance of engaging in bullying behaviors when compared with healthy weight adolescents of the same cohort. Now, results from these three studies suggest that obesity does increase the chances of bullying victimization, and depending on the age, it also increases the chances of bullying victimization and perpetration, and the associated behaviors can hinder adolescent development. Now, let's look at overweight and obesity associations with physical aggression in adolescents. A meta analysis of 23 studies indicated that overweight or obese adolescents were more likely to be physically aggressive than their average weight or underweight peers. The weighted average effect size computed for this study was 0.27, which means that being overweight or obese can account for 27% of the variation on physical aggression. This effect size applied to adolescents across gender, with boys having a slightly higher propensity to aggressive behaviors than girls. While it's possible that being overweight or obese can lead to aggressive behaviors, it is also possibly that inversely, that an aggressive adolescent may become overweight or obese. The meta-analysis was not able to address the causality issue. There is a need for more detailed studies with sub-analysis that need to be conducted in order to have a standardized format in order to increase the accuracy of these results. Food for thought. Before we move on to the next segment of this presentation, I would like you to consider the following using the previously presented information. Do you think that obesity research should be focused on treatment and prevention at the adolescent stage or at the stage of onset? Thank you for listening to me, and I'll see you soon.
So, what can we do to deal with this contemporary issue? Here are the interventions and recommendations. We must to know that we need multiple approaches. One sector is not enough to support adolescents' daily life. For the community, there are two good examples. First, the North Carolina Black Churches Unite for Better Health project implemented a 4-year-long intervention that effectively increased fruit and vegetable intake among African American adults in an effort to promote cancer and comorbid disease prevention. Second, North Carolina Division. The African American Church's Eating Smart and Moving More Guide has focused on diet and physical activity. Two major protective aspects for childhood obesity. Their guide, the African American Churches Eating Smart and Moving More Guide, was distributed to churches in North Carolina. Their guide contains resources and planning ideas for any size church. The goal is to cultivate a partnership between church leaders and the healthy community. This would be really helpful because currently there are too much information and it's hard for parents to get right information about healthy food. So this guide will be really helpful for those people. For school, there are three directions. First, establish policy. Schools should consider establishing a local school wellness policy that includes goals for nutrition education, physical activity, and other school-based activities designed to promote student wellness. Second, they need to improve food quality. Schools should play a role in examining the food quality offered in the cafeteria and increase access to fresh fruit and vegetables, low-fat dairies, and whole grain products. Schools should also examine the food and beverage that are sold in vending machines or school stores. Many of these foods are typically high in sugar, fat, and calories, and low in nutrition value. One study found that replacing standard a la carte items with healthier choices did not lead to a loss in revenue. Another study found that lowering prices of healthier a la carte items lead to a fourfold increase in fruit sales and twice as many as carrot sales. This evidence suggests that schools can provide healthier options without losing sales. And thirdly, schools need to increase physical activities. There is a research to suggest that a school wellness policy may help to address the lack of physical activity opportunities offered in school environment. One study found that only 6.4% of middle schools and 5.8% of high schools provide daily physical education for the entire school year for all the students in each grade. The recommendations we made for government can be divided into three categories: information disclosure policy, policy affecting food supply, and fiscal policies. There are two kinds of information disclosure policy: public information campaigns for social marketing, and advertising controls. Social marketing is defined as a process in which the government attempts to induce voluntary positive changes in individual behavior through the use of a wide range of commercial marketing technologies. Evidence from previous studies shows that these types of interventions can increase consumption of fruits and vegetables. It must be emphasized that social marketing takes a long time to realize the change of attitude between people and society. We hope that policymakers patiently and consistently give social marketing funds and all aspects of support. Advising control is also a representative form of government intervention. Although the effect is weak in some cases, more and more reviews and empirical tests tend to provide evidence that food advertising can affect the amount of unhealthy food people eat. The second category is policies affecting food supply. These kind of policies are more effective. It is a common measure for the state to control the dietary supply of schools and other public sectors, and the government can adjust its nutritional composition, Common policies include free fruits and vegetables and banning junk food vending machines. The government should regulate the ingredient of processed foods or encourage companies to improve their nutritional status, for example, by eliminating trans fat or limiting the content of salt of sugar. There are two kinds of policies that government can address. First, food supply at school. Policies on providing free or subsidized fruit and vegetables promote the consumption successfully in a consistent way in previous studies. There are systematic review of effectiveness of various interventions to promote the consumption of school fruits and vegetables. Results show in most cases, such programs can effectively improve the intake and awareness of students, leading them to conclude that the fruit and vegetable project policy at school can be an effective way to provide public health and agricultural welfare at the same time. Second, food size. There's a common practice of value pricing in the food industries. That is, the larger the proportion, the lower the unit price. This kind of pricing method has been increasing in the past decades, especially in American fast food restaurants. And the super large fast food industry is not considered to be the culprit of the increase of energy intake, obesity, and weight gain. Although increasing obesity trends have a lot to do with the amount of food, unfortunately, there are no examples of policies that specifically prescribe the amount of food. A study found that linear pricing, which is prohibited use value pricing, would encourage fast food consumers to choose small portions of food and soft drinks. We suggest that policymakers, on the basis of the relevant quantitative regulation of food, reasonably guide the consumers to make consumption decisions not based on the size of food, but on its quality, according to the suggestions of economics. The last category is fiscal policies. Such policies are mainly divided into subsidies or taxes, with the intention of influencing the consumption of healthy diet by changing the relative prices of good and bad food or nutrients. Surprisingly, some policies often have the negative results contrary to the good intentions. This will be explained in detail. Vouchers for healthy food. Many vulnerable groups eat worse because they can't afford healthy food such as fruit and vegetables. The government provides vouchers for healthy foods as financial subsidy for these vulnerable groups. The effect of this policy, various literature shows that healthy food voucher for low-income consumers is an effective way to increase the consumption of fruits and vegetables. However, the cost effectiveness still need to be studied. There is evidence that restricting the food choices with the scope of the voucher program may lead to the price changes, which may lead to a decline in other consumers' consumption of healthy food. Tax policy. There is a research show that the huge tax on high-fat food may have a huge impact on diet, but the real-scale fat tax has little impact on consumers' diet and overall weight results. To sum up, we suggest policymakers to make new and more reasonable plans based on the above results and transfer the financial expenditure for these policies to other projects. For the contemporary issue, adolescent obesity, we addressed the most deeply affected group and the reasons, and the psychological features affect teens who are overweight, and the meaningful interventions and recommendations. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching.